Topic 1. I have always said, the body eats, but the one who starves is the soul. I must begin by confessing something that many resist acknowledging. When a person eats in moments of anxiety, it is almost never the body that is hungry. The stomach may be empty, yes, but it is rarely the true source of desire. What aches, what burns, what demands relief is something deeper, older, more primitive, the soul, or rather the unconscious. When I observe patients turning impulsively to food during emotional turmoil, I see not a physiological need, but a symbolic one, a desperate attempt to soothe a tension they cannot name. For you see, anxious appetite is one of the most fundamental strategies the psyche develops to silence internal conflict. The moment the mind becomes overwhelmed by fear, by sadness, by uncertainty, the unconscious searches for the fastest possible anesthetic. Food, being readily available, socially accepted, and immediately gratifying, becomes the perfect tool for this task. The individual believes they are satisfying a physical necessity, yet what they are truly doing is pressing down emotions that feel too frightening to confront directly. When someone eats without hunger, they are enacting a ritual of substitution. They are trying to fill a void that was never located in the stomach to begin with. The unconscious, brilliant in its disguises, uses the language of the body because the individual often refuses to listen to the language of emotion. It is easier to chew than to grieve, easier to swallow than to shout, easier to feel full than to feel vulnerable. Thus, food becomes the intermediary between the tension within and the comfort one cannot find elsewhere. I have often observed that emotional hunger arises precisely when the conscious mind is least willing to acknowledge what is disturbing it. People eat when they feel lonely, but cannot admit to loneliness. They eat when they feel powerless, but cannot admit to helplessness. They eat when they feel invisible, anxious, unworthy, or frightened. But these confessions remain buried beneath layers of psychological defense. Eating becomes the permitted behavior that masks the forbidden emotion. It is important to understand that this process is not an act of weakness, but an act of protection. The psyche is attempting, in its own clumsy yet earnest way, to defend the individual from psychological overload. Emotional eating is therefore not a failure of discipline. It is an emergency measure. The unconscious senses that the person is nearing a threshold they cannot bear, and so it pushes them towards something that promises immediate relief, even if the relief is temporary and illusory. And so, when I say that the body eats but the soul hungers, I am pointing to this profound truth. Behind every anxious bite lies a message the individual has not yet learned to hear. Food is only the messenger, never the meaning. To understand emotional hunger, one must listen not to the stomach, but to the silence beneath it, the silence of feelings repressed, conflicts avoided, and psychological needs unmet. Only then can the true source of hunger be revealed. Topic 2. Food as reward, the silent pact between the id and anxiety. I must confess that whenever I observe emotional eating, I immediately recognize the unmistakable voice of the id, that impulsive, childish, pleasure-seeking force that resides within every human being. The id does not care for logic, reason, or restraint. It demands relief, and it demands it now. When anxiety begins to rise like a storm within the psyche, the id interprets this tension as an urgent signal. Something must be soothed, filled, or quieted immediately. And in its primitive wisdom, it selects food as the easiest and most accessible path toward momentary satisfaction. You must understand that to the id, food is not nourishment. It is reward. It is comfort, distraction, escape, and gratification, all wrapped into one simple act of consumption. When anxiety surges, the id views it as an intolerable state, a disturbance that must be erased without delay. The individual may not consciously decide to eat, but the id pushes them toward the fridge, the pantry, the snack drawer, with the conviction that pleasure is the quickest antidote to distress. And so begins the silent agreement. Anxiety produces tension, and the id promises immediate relief through food. This is why the urge feels so overwhelming and irrational. The ID does not negotiate. It does not weigh consequences. It does not consider whether the person is hungry, healthy, or even willing. It only understands the language of impulses. And anxiety, with its rapid heartbeat and restless mind, amplifies these impulses to a nearly irresistible intensity. The person believes they are choosing to eat, but in truth, they are being pulled by a deeper force, the instinctual drive to extinguish discomfort at any cost. What fascinates me is how this dynamic unfolds beneath the surface of awareness. Most individuals mistake this impulse for a lack of discipline or self-control, when in reality, it is nothing of the sort. It is a psychic mechanism operating automatically, outside the realm of conscious decision-making. The ID seizes control precisely when the ego is weakened by anxiety, exploiting the moment to impose its will. Eating becomes the fastest route to calm, not because the person is weak, but because the ID is powerful and unburdened by morality or rationality. Over time, this creates a vicious cycle. Anxiety triggers the id demands food. The food brings temporary relief, and the relief reinforces the behavior. The unconscious learns that this works, even if only for a fleeting moment. And so the pattern repeats itself, carving deeper grooves in the psyche with each repetition. What began as an impulsive act becomes a conditioned response, a ritual of self-soothing that the person performs almost without thinking. Thus, when I say that food as reward is a silent pact between the id and anxiety, I am revealing a psychological truth. Emotional eating is not a moral failure, but a primitive survival strategy. The mind seeks to protect itself from unbearable tension, and the id, ever impatient and simplistic, rushes to offer the quickest solution. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward breaking the cycle, for one cannot change what one has not yet recognized. Topic 3. The illusion of control. The ego and the mind trying to justify excess. I often say that the ego, poor creature, is the most overworked employee of the human psyche. When anxiety surges and the id clamors for immediate relief, the ego desperately attempts to maintain some semblance of order, but rather than confronting the true source of the tension, which would require emotional courage, the ego takes a far easier route. It invents excuses, and it does so with remarkable creativity. Just one more piece, it whispers. Today was difficult, it insists. I deserve this, it pleads. These justifications feel rational, but they are nothing more than defense mechanisms in elegant disguise. You see, the ego's primary task is to mediate between impulse and reality, yet when anxiety weakens its grasp, it becomes more negotiator than protector. Instead of denying the ID's demands, it attempts to make them seem reasonable. This is why emotional eating is often accompanied by a deceptive sense of logic. The individual imagines they are making a conscious choice, when in truth, the ego is simply trying to maintain the illusion of control while surrendering to the ID's pressure. The mind creates explanations, not to justify the behavior to others, but to soothe its own fragile sense of agency. What fascinates me is how effortlessly humans believe these internal narratives. The ego constructs a story, a momentary justification, and the individual accepts it as truth. It is as though the psyche cannot bear the idea of acting purely on impulse, and so it decorates the act with reasons that feel noble, compassionate, or at least harmless. Yet underneath these stories lies a profound discomfort, the fear of recognizing that anxiety, and not reason, is steering the wheel. When the emotional storm grows strong, the ego feels increasingly threatened. It senses the chaos within and tries to restore balance by giving itself small permissions masked as self-care. Just this once, it says, even though it knows this is not the first time nor the last. But these permissions do not restore control. They simply delay the confrontation with the underlying anxiety. The ego convinces itself that food is a tool of regulation, when in fact each bite is a surrender disguised as autonomy. The tragedy, of course, is that every attempt at justification strengthens the very cycle the ego hopes to break. Each excuse reinforces the behavior, teaching the psyche that emotional relief can always be purchased with food. And so, rather than resolving the anxiety, the ego becomes trapped in a loop of temporary fixes and long-term frustration. It tells itself it is making a choice, but the more it tries to regain control through eating, the more control it actually loses. Thus, when I say that the sense of control provided by emotional eating is an illusion, I do not say it with condemnation, but with clarity. The ego, overwhelmed by the demands of the id and the pressure of reality, fabricates these excuses out of desperation, not weakness. It wants to believe it is guiding the ship, even as the currents of anxiety pull it off course. To break the cycle, one must first understand that the ego is not in control during these moments. It is merely trying to convince itself that it is. Topic 4. The superego and the guilt after eating, the cycle that never ends. After the brief comfort of emotional eating fades, another force steps onto the internal stage, the superego, the moral judge, the inner critic that never sleeps. It arrives almost instantly, as if it had been waiting in the dark just for this moment. And its voice is sharp. You really did it again? You have no control. How could you? This voice doesn't soothe. It punishes. I explain that this guilt is not merely an emotion, but a structural phenomenon within the psyche. The superego appears not to guide, but to accuse. It takes a moment of weakness and transforms it into a moral failure. It turns a craving into a crime. And instead of helping the person regain balance, it pushes them deeper into shame, into self-disgust, into the belief that they are fundamentally flawed. This is not rational guidance. It is internal persecution. The paradox is tragic. The more the superego attacks, the more anxiety it creates. And because the original excess happened because of anxiety, the cycle begins to loop on itself. The guilt generates tension. The tension seeks relief. The relief is found in food, and the food awakens the guilt again. A psychological wheel that never stops spinning. In this section, I reveal how the superego subtly reinforces the very behavior it condemns. By crushing the person with shame, it makes the mind desperate for escape. And when the mind is desperate, it returns to what it knows, even if what it knows is harmful. The superego's punishment, instead of producing discipline, produces fragility. It weakens the will, fractures self-esteem, and increases emotional hunger. This dynamic becomes a kind of internal torture chamber. Pleasure followed by punishment, relief followed by self-hatred. The individual is trapped between the impulsive comfort of the moment and the harsh judgment that comes immediately after. It's a perfect cycle for suffering, elegant in its structure, devastating in its consequences. Ultimately, I show that this cycle doesn't just affect behavior, it corrodes the soul. It teaches the person to fear themselves, to distrust their own impulses, and to believe that they are unworthy of peace. The superego promises control, but delivers anguish. It promises morality, but delivers despair. And until this cycle is understood, named and brought into the light, it repeats endlessly, a psychological loop that feeds on anxiety and breeds more of it. Topic 5. The deeper truth. No one overeats unless they are trying to protect themselves from something. I conclude by revealing a truth that is often hidden beneath layers of shame and misunderstanding. Emotional eating is not a failure. It is a survival strategy. No one eats beyond their physical hunger unless some part of them is trying, desperately, to feel safe. Overeating is not a lack of discipline. It is a plea for comfort, for stability, for relief from an internal storm that feels unbearable. In this final section, I explain that emotional hunger is a message from within, a sign that something inside is overwhelmed, overloaded, stretched beyond its limits. The person isn't reaching for food because they are weak, but because they are hurting. They are seeking warmth in a world that feels cold, control in a world that feels chaotic, quiet in a mind that won't stop shouting. The excess is not the enemy. The pain beneath it is. I show that anxiety-driven eating is a symptom of a deeper emotional landscape that has become too heavy to carry. It is an attempt to create a momentary refuge, a shelter from inner conflicts, unprocessed grief, loneliness, fear, or the silent wounds that we often pretend not to feel. When the world inside becomes too loud, the act of eating becomes a temporary mute button. But there is hope, profound, transformative hope. I explain that the moment we begin to understand this process, something shifts. When we name the pain, its power weakens. When we recognize the pattern, the cycle begins to loosen. Awareness is not just insight, it is liberation. It is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy over our desires and reconnecting with our true needs. I emphasize that healing does not come from punishment or restriction, but from compassion. By understanding the purpose of emotional hunger, by seeing it not as an enemy, but as a signal, we allow ourselves to grow, to regulate differently, to soothe ourselves in ways that honor our inner world instead of numbing it. The goal is not to silence the hunger, but to listen to it more deeply than ever before. In the end, I leave the viewer with a final essential truth. No one overeats because they are broken. They overeat because they are trying to survive something that has not yet been spoken. And once it is spoken, once the hidden injury is finally seen, the soul no longer needs to scream through the body. Peace becomes possible again.